switch over to these. So I'm very honored to actually be asked to do the presentation on this book. As I've read all the books all along, ever since The Water is Wide all the way through, ever since back in those times up until just a few years ago when I finally decided to pick up The Death of Santini. I was a little hesitant about it because I knew it was a pretty dark book. Not that the others weren't, but they were a little bit of a shorter story, and this one, those of you who have read it know that this is just a very long story from beginning to the end to when the dad passes away. And of course, at the same time, I've just finished Sandra's book. So I'm getting filled even more with all this, the story of Pat's life and the story of Pat and Sandra's life kind of get a little bit confusing in that. I just love this book. I did find that I would read it. It would be very intense. I'd have to actually put it down and leave it for a few days, but I couldn't leave it for very long. I had to then turn around and pick it back up because it had that much momentum and drive within it that this was the real story between all the other stories, is The Death of Santini. I think, as you all know, it is a memoir. And the interaction between the siblings, the story of the siblings are being brought out even fuller in this, and of course all the, we learned about the mother and about the grandmother Stanley and a lot more about Dawn in this, and a lot more about Pat. And even though I knew Pat since high school, and so I'm going to segue back to Pat and I were in Beaufort High School together, and we have a couple of Pat's teachers right down here. We have Grace Dennis and Deanne Foster are joining us today. And my husband, Paul Kaufman, he came back in, was a good friend of Pat's from high school also. They were in the same class. I was a couple of classes behind Pat, but as it turned out, he and my brother played basketball together. So I used to hang out and watch them practice basketball. I think they would sometimes do it at the air station, and sometimes they do it on Paris Island, and so wherever it was, I was often watching that. In addition, Pat and I were in a French class together. He was 2 years ahead of me, but for whatever reason, I had moved up in French, and he was maybe just getting started in part of it, but we were in French class together. And then the joy of my life now is that we were on the literary magazine together, and there's a section, if you go back into our annual, where there's 30 of us in the literary magazine, there were 5 of us that were pulled out to be what we call section editors. So I got a picture of me with Pat back in high school as the section editor of a literary magazine, and I am now an author. So that really brings a lot of joy to me to be able to look back and see that. So Pat was very popular in high school. He only came to Beaufort, for his junior and senior year. He'd been to 10 schools in 10 years, and as you heard the siblings talk, they moved even more after that. He was at the Citadel, and the family just kept moving and kept moving. And of course, I was a military brat too. I moved a lot, not quite as much as Pat did. So in my annual, when I went, Here Comes the Water is Wide has come out and is popular, and The Great Santini has come out and been popular, and I'm in New York. I have this career in theater in New York, and I'm following Pat's career, and of course The Prince of Tides comes out. But I go back into my annual one day, and I say, Pat must have signed it in here somewhere. And there I find, Dear Stephanie, good Frenching, the language that is, love Pat. So that's the kind of wit he had way back then, and it was just exactly how Pat was. Gene Norris was my English teacher, as he was Pat's, and of course Gene Norris ended up being Pat's mentor through his entire career until Gene passed away. Bill Dufford was our teacher, again, Pat's mentor. Randy Randall, who was Pat's very, very good friend, who passed away, died on the baseball mound pitching the game. There was very few of us there, but I happened to be there. My brother was there, Pat was there, we were all there and witnessed what happened to Randy. Paul, my husband, was very good friends with Randy as well. There's just a lot of connections going back. And of course, I knew who Bernie Shine was, but I didn't really know Bernie Shine the way that all of us know Bernie Shine today. And he was a character in high school, and he is a character today. Yes? Yes, he is. And a very, very good friend to Pat his whole life. So I moved back here after about 22 years in theater, and I came back and I was first director of the SHED Center for the Arts in Port Royal, if anybody was around in those days and remembers that center over there. And that was the only reason I could really come back. I wanted to come back, but I thought, well, what am I going to do? I've been a dancer and a costumer in New York for all those years. What am I going to do in Beaufort? But I'd love to come back here. Well, I was offered that job, and I just kind of segued forward in there, started writers groups and things like that. And so I always had Pat as my friend. We connected through email. Back in those days, he would actually respond to an email, and then that kind of went away. I think you could actually leave a voicemail in those days, and that kind of thing went away also. You could never, Pat could call you, and if you saw his name on your phone, you wanted to stop whatever you're doing so you could have a conversation with him, but you could never leave a voicemail for Pat. It was always full. So anyway, I have become an author. I have written a book called What We Set in Motion, which is a journey story of a young woman who is deciding what to do after college when the family says, you got to do this, that, and the other thing, and her heart wants to do something else. And when her daddy turns to her and said, if you leave anyway, don't you ever come back. And her heart is totally broken. So, segueing right back to what we were talking about, which is the death of Santini, which is just a brilliant book. And what I understand, it took him about 4 years to write. And this was the last book that he actually sat down to write. The last book will be A Low Country Heart, which is a compilation of essays of Pat's. This was the last book that he wrote, and he delved into the family quite deeply. So, one thing that Pat said about the book is, when I was 30 years old, my novel, The Great Santini, was published, and there were many things in that book I was afraid to write or feared that no one would believe. But this year, I turned 65, the official starting date of old age and the beginning countdown of my inevitable death. I've come to realize that I still carry the bruised freight of the childhood every day. I can't run away, hide, or pretend it never happened. I wear it on my back like the carapace of a tortoise, except that my shell burdens and does not protect. It weighs me down and fills me with dread. The Conroy children were all casualties of war, conscripts in a battle we didn't sign up for on the bloodied envelope of our birth certificates. Amazing words that he could come up with. All authors want to have a Kirkus review, and Pat's Kirkus review on this book was hugely long. But when I got to the last sentence, I said, wow, did this guy know how to sum it up? The moving true story of an unforgivable father and his unlikely redemption. So for those of you who have read The Death of Santini, you know that it's not just about the brutality that he inflicted on his family when they were children. It is actually the change in Donald Conroy and how it came about and how this family was able to express forgiveness. It's a beautiful story if you can read beyond the depth of the trauma that is also going on at the same time. Another description of this is, the death of Santini is a heart-wrenching account of personal and family struggle and a poignant lesson in how ties of blood can both strangle and offer succor. It is an act of reckoning and exorcism of demons, but one whose ultimate conclusion is that love can soften even the meanest of men, giving meaning to one of the most often quoted lines from his best-selling novel, The Prince of Tides. In families, there are no crimes that cannot be forgiven. And I think that's such a great lesson for all of us to learn. And if Pat did nothing else, he offered us a window to do that in our own lives. So I searched back into the book a little bit more for what I thought was, what would he think that he is doing with this book? Where did he think that this story, the way he told it, was going? And in the prologue, I found, I've got to try and make sense of it one last time. A final circling of the block, a reckoning, another dive into the caves of the coral reef where the morays wait in ambush. One more night flight into the immortal darkness to study that house of pain one final time. Then I'll be finished with you, Mom and Dad. I'll leave you in peace and not bother you again. And I'll pray that your stormy spirits find peace in the house of the Lord. But I must examine the wreckage one more time. He then dedicates this book to his siblings. Carol Ann, the Conroy family poet and fabulist, the great explainer of it all. Mike, the keystone, the calm in the midst of the family storm, the center that always holds. Kathy, the family nurse, Santini's caretaker and confessor, the azalea crafted with iron. Jim, our brightest, most brilliant sibling, also our dark and hilarious commentator on the flawed clan. Tim, the kindest and sweetest Conroy, a compassionate worker, and with special needs kids who brought joy into the lives of all he taught. Tom, our lost boy and baby brother, whose suicide was the mortal wound to the heart of this family and reminded us of how bad it really was. And you heard him in this video give so much thanks to his family, because that's a lot. That's a lot to have your life exposed that many times. And from everything that I understand now is that the siblings were always there when everybody else was not. Some of the praise, I'm just going to pull out a few of them because there's so much praise for this book, but Conroy writes with a momentum that's impossible to resist. Conroy takes aim at our darkest emotions, lets the arrow fly, and hits a bullseye almost every time. Pat Conroy's writing contains a virtue now rare in most contemporary fiction: passion. And the one that really stood out to me, God preserve Pat Conroy. And this was his last book. So story is so important. I was also trying to figure out with Pat his need to tell the story, and he seemed to tell a similar story over and over, but he was pushed to do this from deep within him. And I have a presentation that I do on my career in theater. It's called Inside Stories, A Journey Through Broadway Film and Television. And I've done it for Ollie several times, and I did it just recently. It's usually sold out. But each time I question, why do people keep coming back? Because people actually come back and listen to it again. Or why are they here in the first place? Filling in the gaps between a lot of famous people where you would know most of the things about them. You would know from Entertainment Tonight and People and all of the other magazines, but there's all these stories that I know, and people are so curious about them. But story is so important to all of us. It is almost part of our DNA. And there was a wonderful article in the Scientific American that explained this, that just like when we get hungry for food, we know we have to eat. I personally get low blood sugar. My husband knows this. When I have to eat, I have to stop and eat. But we have that same need for story. Stories have been passed on long before we had writing and books, etc., etc. Stories passed on, learning from generation to generation. There's something that we learn in these stories that help us with our lives. As we hear the last story and the last interpretation, we internalize it into ourselves, and then we express that out into the world. And stories, as we know, one of Pat's favorite phrases was, tell me a story. He was craving stories all the time. And yet he turned around and gave us some of the most interesting stories I think that have ever been written. Because they teach us something about ourselves. And if we can get that out of someone's writing, isn't that amazing? You could sit down with a therapist for a long time and not get sometimes what you can get out of reading somebody like Pat Conroy's work. And when I've done my docening at the Conroy Center, one story in particular that I remember is a woman who's a journalist came in with her husband. We were still over on Charles Street, so it was earlier on. And we were doing the tour, and it can take from 20 minutes to 45 minutes or so to do it, depending on somebody's interest level and time, et cetera, et cetera. So at the end, she tells me that she just went through a terrible time the year before, maybe 6 months before, where she had lost her mother, then her father, and then her beloved dog, all within a month. And she went into a deep depression, and she went to bed. She said, I gotta go to bed, I'm just staying in there, it was Christmas. And all of a sudden she looked up, and there she had bookshelves in her room, in her bedroom, and she had all of Pat Conroy's books there, and she said, I'm just gonna start reading The Water is Wide. She went through every book for that next month, and by the time she was done with the last book, her spirits were lifted. It didn't change what had happened, but it changed how she reacted to everything. And it was a healing for her, and she moved on. And I know we all get something different out of Pat's work, and we'd all get something different out of the death of Santini. Everybody's a member of a family, and everybody has a different perspective of what happened in that family, because you're at a different age, and you were in a different room, and it just all is a little bit different. But I thought it was just amazing that she just chose to read Pat's books, and it had a huge healing. It had a huge healing effect on her. So I will move now into wanting to know how many people have read most all of Pat's books. Great. How many have read Death of Santini? How many are intending to read Death of Santini, got it on their mind, got it home somewhere, halfway through, whatever. It is a fabulous book. And like I said, I had a hard time getting through it. I would have to put it down and walk away, and then I'd have to come back. But I got so much out of it because of the importance of story. So some of the dynamics, and I'm going to turn this over to questions and comments from you, is what I want to do. We're going to be able to pass around these microphones, I hope, and I hope some of you have comments and questions. But some of the things that occurred to me from reading this was the toll that abuse takes on the soul. And we heard Pat say at the end, I never got over it. Even when Don was dying and had passed, I was always had that little boy afraid inside of me, always. So there's a big toll that takes on the soul. Don's turnaround. I am still amazed that happened, and that this family was able to forgive and embrace. Peg comes from the mom, for those of you who haven't read it. Comes from a very, very poor family. I'll talk about Stanley in a minute, which is actually such an interesting character. But Peg loved Gone with the Wind, loved Scarlett O'Hara, had a bit of that in her from all that we have read and seen. And yet she was the daughter of Stanley, came from very, very poor origin. Interesting that she was so angry at Pat for writing The Great Santini. And then when the movie came out and was going to be here in Beaufort, she was fighting tooth and nail to get more seats for her family to go and see it. So she went through that exposure side where, I think a lot of us heard from our parents, please don't tell our stories out of school. Please don't do that. Don't ever tell what's going on in the family. Well, Pat was compelled to do it, and I think on some level he might have felt he was encouraged by Peg because she was so interested in stories and literature and poetry. Then we have Stanny, her mother, and when you read the book, if you haven't read it yet, you'll find out that Stanny left all her children and moved to Atlanta and left them with this husband of hers who was a pretty strict guy who didn't feed them very often. And she was a character and a half. I can see a lot of Pat coming out of Stanny. Forgiveness, major theme in this book. And then Pat enduring the criticism. So here comes the great Santini. Everybody in the world loves it, but all these extended family members and friends, and even people here in Beaufort, didn't like a lot of it. And he had to endure a lot of criticism at the same time that he was getting praise around the world for it. Very hard thing to do. Loss. There's a lot of loss and deaths in this book, and how the family had to deal with all of these. And then of story, I've already talked about the importance of story. And then Pat's need to tell his story in order to understand his own story. So none of us really go through life without a bit of trauma. I think that we all know that at this point that hardship is our best teacher in life, as long as you know how to be a student. And it doesn't behoove anyone to remain a victim. And I think that might be something you can really get out of this book. So I want to open up the floor